There is a promise your government made to you. It was made before you were born. It was made to your parents and to their parents before them. The promise was simple. Work your whole life, pay into the system, and when you're old, the system will take care of you. It's a promise built into the very foundation of the modern world. And right now, the mathematics behind that promise are quietly, systematically falling apart. Today, we're not talking about a scandal. We're not talking about corruption or mismanagement, though there's some of that too. We're talking about something more unsettling, a structural collapse hiding in plain sight. A mathematical problem so large that most governments have chosen to whisper about it rather than explain it. This is the story of the system of what happens to you when you are old. Where that system came from, how it worked, why it's breaking, and what the numbers say about what happens next. I'm Malcolm. This is History Meets Economics. Thank you so much for subscribing. Before we can understand the collapse, we have to understand the creation. Because here is something most people don't know. The concept of retirement, the idea that there is a phase of life after work funded by society, is barely 150 years old. For thousands of years, there was no such thing as retirement. You worked until you couldn't. When your body gave out, your family supported you, or if you had no family, the poorhouse did. The idea of the state guaranteeing financial security in old age simply did not exist. That changed in 1889. The man who changed it was Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of the German Empire. And if you're expecting a story about a compassionate statesman moved by the suffering of workers, I'm going to disappoint you. Bismarck was a political operator of the highest order. By the 1870s and 1880s, Germany was rapidly industrializing. Workers were flooding into cities, and alongside them came a growing socialist movement, one that threatened to upend the established political order. Bismarck's response was calculated. He decided to neutralize the socialists not by crushing them, but by stealing their agenda. In 1889, Germany enacted the Old Age and Disability Insurance Bill, the world's first universal state pension. Participation was mandatory. Contributions were split between workers, employers, and the government. And it operated on a pay-as-you-go basis. The contributions of today's working generation funded the pensions of today's retirees. But here is a detail that matters enormously to the story we're about to tell. The retirement age was set at 70, and at the time, the average life expectancy in Germany was approximately 55 years. Do you understand what that means? The pension was, by design, a program that most workers would never live to collect. It was not a retirement plan in the modern sense. It was a political safety valve. The money flowed in from millions of workers. The payouts went to the relatively small number who survived long enough to claim them. The math worked perfectly, but majorly for the government. But that math would not work forever. The idea spread slowly at first, then all at once. France introduced old age insurance in 1930. The United States created Social Security in 1935, a response to the Great Depression, which had left millions of elderly Americans destitute. After World War II, pension systems expanded dramatically across the developed world. Benefits were extended, coverage widened, and in many countries during the 1970s and 1980s, retirement ages were actually lowered. In France, the retirement age was cut from 65 all the way to 60 under President Mitterrand in 1981, as governments competed to offer more generous social contracts. For a while, the economics were comfortable, almost seductively so. The post-war baby boom flooded the workforce with young workers for decades. In 1950, across OECD countries, there were approximately 7.2 people of working age for every person aged 65 or over. Pay-as-you-go systems run on that ratio. They need enough workers paying in to cover the retirees taking out. And for a generation, that ratio held. The problem is what happened next. Let me give you some numbers. Because the crisis we're about to describe isn't a theory or a partisan forecast. It's arithmetic. The World Economic Forum examined the 8 largest pension markets in the world. What they found was this. In 2015, those 8 countries already had a combined retirement savings gap. The difference between what people would need to retire comfortably and what was actually saved, of $70 trillion. 1.5 times the combined GDP of all 8 nations. And that gap was growing by $28 billion every single day. If current trajectories continue, that gap is projected to reach $400 trillion by 2050. Approximately 5 times the size of today's entire global economy. $400 trillion. So why is this happening? Because it isn't one problem. It's 3 problems happening simultaneously. People are living longer. When Bismarck designed his pension in a country where average life expectancy was 55, the system would rarely have to pay out for long. When the United States set Social Security's retirement age at 65 in 1935, average American life expectancy was about 61. Again, most workers wouldn't collect long enough to strain the system. Today, the WEF notes that babies born in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan have a realistic chance of living past 100. What was designed to pay out for a few years is now expected to pay out for 2, sometimes 3 decades. At the same time, birth rates collapsed. In 1950, OECD countries averaged about 2.8 children per woman of childbearing age. By the early 2000s, that had fallen to 1.7, below the 2.1 replacement rate needed to simply maintain population. Fewer babies meant fewer future workers. And fewer future workers meant fewer people paying into the system. The worker-to-retiree ratio stood at 7.2 in 1950. It fell to 4.1 by 2010. It is on course to reach just 2.1 by 2050 across high-income countries. 2 workers for every 1 retiree. And the third problem, the promises were never adjusted. As life expectancy rose and birth rates fell, retirement ages remained largely frozen. Benefit levels were maintained or expanded. The gap between what the system promised and what the mathematics could deliver grew wider with each passing year. Because adjusting the promise means telling voters, especially older voters who reliably show up at the polls, that what they were guaranteed may not fully materialize. So most governments said very little. Start with the United States. Social Security is not just a program. It is the single most important source of retirement income for America's elderly, relied upon by approximately 91 to 94% of all retirees. About 70 million beneficiaries received payments in 2025. About 185 million workers were paying in. And the system's own trustees, not political opponents, not advocacy groups, but the official government board responsible for the program, have been sounding an alarm in their annual reports for years. According to the 2025 Trustees Report, Social Security's costs have exceeded its non-interest income every year since 2010. The Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund is projected to exhaust its reserves by 2033. At that point, incoming payroll tax revenue would cover only approximately 77% of scheduled benefits. Without legislative action, benefits would face a cut of roughly 19%, regardless of age, income, or need. And that's only the federal program. At the state and local level, America's public pension plans carried unfunded liabilities of $1.34 trillion as of 2024. The funded ratio, the share of promised obligations backed by actual assets, was 80.6%. For every dollar promised to public workers, only 80 cents exists to pay for it. That funded ratio has been below 90%, the threshold considered fragile, for 17 consecutive years. In 2007, state and local governments contributed about 16.8% of worker payroll into pension funds. By 2024, that had risen to 31.3%. Governments are now paying nearly twice as much as they were 17 years ago, and still cannot close the gap. Unfunded liabilities are accruing interest faster than contributions can address them. The Equable Institute calls this conditioned pension debt paralysis. In 2023, the tension between pension mathematics and political reality exploded onto the streets of France in a way the world couldn't ignore. France has one of the most generous pension systems among industrialized nations, spending nearly 14% of its entire economic output on pensions, more than almost any comparable country. And it had one of the lowest standard retirement ages in the developed world, 62 years old. President Macron's government had warned since 2017 that without new revenue, the system would fall into structural deficits. The French labor minister stated plainly that without immediate action, the pension deficit would exceed $13 billion annually by 2027. Macron's proposed solution was modest by European standards, raise the minimum retirement age from 62 to 64. The response was unlike anything France had seen in decades. In January 2023, more than 1 million people took to the streets. By March, the Interior Ministry confirmed more than 1.28 million demonstrators in a single day of action. Workers in energy, transport, and garbage collection went on strike. More than 7,000 tons of uncollected rubbish piled up across Paris. Refineries were blockaded. When the bill failed to secure a majority in the National Assembly, Macron invoked Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, a provision allowing legislation to pass without a parliamentary vote. The Constitutional Council ultimately approved the reform in April 2023. But here's what matters for the story we're telling. What happened in France was not really about 2 years. It was about the collision between a mathematical reality and a social identity. The French pension system had embedded a certain promise about the boundary between work and rest. And when that line moved, even incrementally, millions of people felt a foundational agreement being revoked. Every government in the developed world is now quietly wrestling with exactly that same question. If France shows us the political difficulty of reform, Asia shows us the demographic extremity of the problem. Japan was the first country to experience what researchers call super-aging, a society where more than 20% of the population is aged 65 or older. Today, more than 1 in 10 Japanese citizens is aged 80 or above. Fertility rates have been below the 2.1 replacement level for more than 50 years. An IMF paper estimated that demographic change alone will reduce Japan's annual economic growth by an average of 0.8% over the next 40 years. A United Nations Population Division study found that to maintain its current worker-to-retiree ratio without significant immigration, Japan would need to raise its effective retirement age to 77 years. Not 65, not 67, 77. South Korea is following Japan's path, but faster. South Korea now has the lowest fertility rate in the world, 0.72 children per woman as of 2022, less than a third of the replacement rate. At the end of 2024, South Korea officially became a super-aged society. Old people, fewer working class. Japan took 11 years to make that transition. Europe took 19 years. South Korea made it in roughly 7. South Korea's national pension scheme is projected to exhaust its reserves by 2055, and both Japan and Korea are on course to reach support ratios at or below 2.0 workers per retiree, a level researchers describe as unsustainable. The machine was engineered for one world. It is being operated in another. There is another layer to this story that concerns a quiet shift over the last 40 years in who actually bears the risk of retirement. For most of the 20th century, if you worked for a significant employer, your retirement was covered by a defined benefit pension, a plan where your employer guaranteed you a specific monthly income in retirement. The employer bore the investment risk. If markets performed poorly, the company was responsible for making up the difference. In 1975, defined benefit plans covered approximately 2/3 of all pension plan participants in the United States. Then the architecture changed. Employers began moving toward defined contribution plans, the 401k. In a 401k, the employer no longer guarantees an outcome. The employee chooses how much to contribute, or whether to contribute at all. Whatever the market produces over a worker's career becomes their retirement income. The investment risk is fully transferred to the individual. By 2021, among private sector workers in the United States with access to any retirement plan, only 15% had access to a defined benefit pension. For lower income workers, those without college education, workers without stable employment histories, the median retirement savings balance is effectively zero. The World Economic Forum found that under current trajectories, retirees in 6 major economies would outlive their savings by an average of 8 to 20 years. 8 to 20 years of living expenses with no assets to cover them. I keep thinking about it, so what happens to them? Go back to work. The 3-legged stool, government pension, employer pension, and personal savings has become, as the CEO of State Street Investment Management described it at the 2025 World Economic Forum in Davos, somewhat wobbly. Every government facing this crisis has essentially the same toolkit: raise retirement ages, increase contributions, reduce benefits, or borrow. Most are quietly doing pieces of all of these things, while the magnitude of the gap remains largely absent from the mainstream conversation. The WEF has noted that for countries where future generations have life expectancies of over 100, including the US, UK, Canada, and Japan, a retirement age of at least 70 may need to become the norm by 2050. Pause on that. In 1889, Bismarck set the retirement age at 70 precisely because he knew most people wouldn't live to collect. In 2050, researchers are suggesting we may need to return to 70, because people now routinely live well into their 80s and 90s. The circle closes. But raising the retirement age is politically explosive, as France demonstrated. Cutting benefits is equally unpopular. Raising payroll taxes suppresses wages, and governments that simply borrow to fill the gap are shifting the burden to future generations who have no vote in the decision. The WEF used a striking analogy to describe the pension crisis, the financial equivalent of climate change. Not because the problems are equivalent, but because both are slow-moving structural crises where the worst consequences accumulate gradually, which makes it easy, year after year, to delay the hard decisions. There is something else that often gets lost in discussions. The people at the center of the story are not actuarial tables or funded ratios. They are people who worked for decades on the understanding that a contract existed, that the system they paid into throughout their working lives would be there when they needed it. People made major decisions: when to retire, where to live, how much to save, based on that understanding. This episode is not a political argument. It is not a call to cut social programs or to expand them. It is a call for honesty, for the kind of honest public conversation that the mathematics of this problem demands. The numbers are not a secret. The depletion dates are published in government reports. The funding gaps are documented by international institutions. The worker-to-retiree ratios are tracked by the OECD. The information is available. The question is whether societies choose to have a clear-eyed conversation about it. Otto von Bismarck, for all his political calculation, put one thing into motion that genuinely changed the world: the idea that a society has an obligation to its elderly. I want to know, do you support him? The challenge of this era is not to abandon that idea. It is to understand honestly and clearly what it will take to sustain it, and to make those decisions before the choice is made for us by arithmetic. That conversation is overdue. If you made it this far, you understand why this episode doesn't have a clean ending. The story is still being written in legislative chambers, in actuarial reports, and in the retirement plans of billions of people who don't yet know whether the promise will be kept, but keep paying. If economic history done right is what you're here for, subscribe to History Meets Economics. Every episode is built on the same commitment: facts first. Every time. If you think it's right, explain. I'm Malcolm. Here's another moment history met economics.